And I specifically go after the higher end, demographic, the ones that can afford to spend more and are willing to spend more for a premium product.
Hey investors, Bradley here from Watson Estates, and you're listening to the largest, fastest growing podcast for Toronto real estate on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Now, you're probably here because you love keeping up to date on the latest news, what's going on in the local Toronto real estate market. But I think it's important we take time to talk to investors, people that are ultra successful at what they do. And today we have the infamous Andrew Hines on the show. He is the host of the Andrew Hines Show podcast. And a great guy. And today we covered great topics as well. I'm not all that familiar in the rental space, so I was able to have a conversation with him about what does that look like? Where are there opportunities if I'm considering maybe that avenue? But we don't stop there. No, because we start talking about economics. We start talking about what should I be doing and considering with my portfolio in order to be successful in the next few years here in Canadian real estate. I know you guys are going to get a lot of value out of the show. Please hit that like button, leave a comment down below, and support the channel. And if you haven't already, take some time to jump over to the Andrew Hines podcast as well. Enjoy the show. Andrew, thanks for joining us on the show today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
I am thrilled to have you on the show. No doubt anyone who follows our channel has heard or is familiar with your episodes as well, specifically if they're in the investing side. Maybe for those who are maybe unfamiliar with your face or, trying to get a feel for what you do as we kind of set the tone for today, tell us a little bit about where you come from.
Okay, so I'm a real estate investor. I started primarily investing in student rentals, bought my first property back in 2011 and started building up a student rental portfolio by using the BRRRR method. So that's where you buy, renovate, rent, refinance, and then repeat. I really stand behind that method. I think it's the best way for Canadians. Well, traditionally in the last 5 years has been the best way for Canadians to create wealth. And I'm heavily focused on cash flow. Along the way, because I was doing big renovations and building additions, I got asked to start building some new construction for someone. I started my own construction company. I've built, I guess we're nearing on 50 plus units between townhouses and houses, as well as doing my own renovations and addition builds on my properties. So that's the short version. Of course, we can do a longer version, but kind of had my hand in multiple different parts of the process.
Yeah, I think if we're going to dive in to kind of set the tone, maybe tell us a little bit about what housing types you do, what markets you're in, where these units located that you've had under your belt.
Right. So all my investment portfolio right now is in London, Ontario. Outside of that, the only other places I've invested, minus doing a couple of like wholesales or bird dogs or stuff like that, has been in Ohio, which is another entirely different conversation. Went down there for the cash flow, came back regretting it. Not that you can't win doing that kind of thing, but I learned my 20s were really just nothing but hard knocks, trying things, getting burned, getting hurt, and recovering and cleaning up the mess. And I learned a lot by going through that. They say you learn from mistakes or mentors. I learned mostly from mistakes. And then, of course, I did have some really good mentors. So kind of combining all of that. So the type of units I'm in London, primarily single family homes, renting out houses to groups of students. So there might be 5 students all on one lease. And one of them is actually a duplex, but yeah, generally speaking, the students really value having houses. I like going after that market, the ones that want to have a house, they want to have a backyard. And I specifically go after the higher end, demographic, the ones that can afford to spend more and are willing to spend more for a premium product. So I create a very premium product when I buy a property. So part of my process would be to buy it, renovate it. Typically, I try and create ensuite bathrooms in every bedroom if I can. And by doing that, I'm able to charge quite the premium in rent. And it's also a lot easier to rent and fill vacant rooms.
Yeah. And okay, so let's go down the rental. I want to come back eventually and talk about some of the people that have influenced you in your career as well in investing. But while we're here, let's talk a little bit about student rentals. So I haven't touched student rentals with a pole. And there's a lot of people that are very reluctant. What are some of, if we were to outline them, what are some of the downside risks, I guess, that you've experienced that you seem to see are scaring people off? And then what are the reasons that you say, despite those, it's still worth it for me as an investor to dive into that arena?
The downsides are it's more of a business. You really do need to understand your school. You need to understand the rental cycle at your school. And if you miss critical dates, you put yourself at a significant disadvantage to get re-rentals. And then you'll have landlords who don't have their property rented out by, say, March or into April, and May 1 is when their unit becomes available again. You might have landlords that are having students email them and say, hey, you know what, will you do an 8-month lease and something like that? So what, am I going to just carry the property for 4 months over the summer? That's probably the biggest fear in a landlord's head. I do 12-month leases starting May 1st. My rental season, when I'm trying to get people to agree to rent, is way back in say October, November of the previous year. So I'm renting them out for the May 1st coming back in October or November, and that allows me to sort of mitigate that challenge. But I want to have that superior product so that when all the other landlords are kind of being looked over, I'll make sure that I do get a good look, a fair look. And I'll also look for superior locations. I think that's really important. It's not to say that you can't do well with fringe locations or locations that are kind of pushing the boundaries of where you would ideally want to be. So in terms of other negatives, people are worried about students causing damage. That, generally speaking, has never been that severe. If you have good handy people in part of your operation, there's no issue. I think it really all comes back to systems. You've got to have systems and people. You can't just buy one and expect to be good at running a student rental. You need to have a mentor. You need to have people showing you or talking to other investors that are doing it, saying, what are your processes? When do you do this? When do you do that? And I noticed you didn't ask me, but I'll just go ahead and say it. The benefit is cash flow. I see significantly more cash flow in student rentals versus buying the exact same house priced, for a single family.
Right.
So that's the big difference. It's been, in my portfolio, $600 a month for an average property is a good, a decent cash flow. I've got, up to, maybe $1,000, $1,200 a month on other properties. Those are incredible cash flows compared to what a lot of people can do in single family. And then, of course, we're talking Toronto here, this Toronto podcast. That's not very common. So it really is a business, and it's not for the faint of heart. But if you go in understanding that and being willing to do the work, I think it can pay dividends in the future greatly.
Do you find any extra challenges? So from what I've heard through the grapevine is it sounds like it could be more difficult. And now I'm more in the apartment side, but on the financing, right? Like do they give you a harder time with these lease agreements, or because you're in the single family, maybe you're avoiding that, or things like insurance? Like do you find that you're kind of, taken for a ride sometimes on these programs to try and get things running? Maybe your maintenance budget, like I'm curious if that's higher in order to make these things work.
Good questions. Okay, so financing, let's just take it one by one and remind me if I miss one. So financing, single family is the way I've financed the ones I have. However, you can finance them commercially under a Charter A bank, a Schedule A bank, like BMO, TD, on their commercial lending side. On their residential lending side, their policy is pretty much going to be a firm no, we do not do student rentals. So early on, I think most investors are going to sneak it through on the residential side. And the key way that I've been able to do that is you make it a normal house. Yeah, sure, I might have extra ensuite bathrooms and stuff, but it still functions as a normal house. The appraiser comes in, looks at it as that. The things you can do to kind of avoid trouble is make sure that you have an appraiser coming in that actually knows what they're doing and understands, how to make it appear to the bank that it's okay. That's been my process, really controlling the process, controlling who comes in, making sure that they understand the asset, making sure that they understand the value, and say the right things in that report that aren't going to get the bank's, antennas up to potentially have an issue with it. And of course, you will see deals that go south when the bank didn't know it was a student rental, and then they all of a sudden find out and they cancel the deal. I've seen that coming from the mortgage broker world. I actually I'm still licensed as a mortgage agent, so I don't do that anymore, but I definitely have seen that. So that's certainly a challenge with financing, but it is still very doable. I've seen a lot of them getting done with CIBC. I've worked with a few different contacts. They've basically financed all of my student rentals. And I'm very open with the person I work with about what the asset is, and he knows how to position it so that it gets approved.
Do you see, before we move on to the next one, do you see limits on that? Like given
Yes.
that you're working with A-lenders, do you think there's going to be a cap on there?
There always is.
Yeah.
So CIBC, it's 5 units with them, or five houses with them. I've maxed with them, but the next step is to go to commercial lending,
Yep.
or you work with credit unions. So the other one that I didn't get into is you can work with local credit unions. They're a lot more open to it. Full disclosure, they might cut back your loan to value. They might take you to 75%, but I believe Libro, and I don't mean to name drop too much here, but I believe my friend who's done quite a few more than I have is doing everything with Libro now in London, and they're going to 75% for him. The only difficulty is they're not giving him the 30-year amortization. They're keeping him at 25. So it does restrict your cash flow a little bit as you grow. But as you grow, you naturally get better at finding better deals, finding better value, learning how to maximize cash flow. So what I've really seen for him is, he's sort of had uncapped growth. And I still believe it's very possible. But for the average person, getting a handful of student rentals is going to be, pretty impactful in changing their financial destiny.
No doubt. No doubt. Okay. So let's jump on the insurance side. Have you seen any challenges with getting insurance there, or anything they're looking for a little more closely?
Generally speaking, not a challenge. You just need to know who to talk to. If you go to your regular insurer, whoever you're working with, like I used to work with TD Monitz because I was an alumni of Western. I am an alumni of Western, and they had a program. It was great. And I said student rental to them, and they're like, "Yeah, we don't do that." And you keep asking around, and you keep hearing, "Well, no, we don't do that." But as soon as you work with a broker that understands that business and deals in commercial insurance, all of a sudden things get a lot easier. And so I would really, really stress that if you're going to go into this game, make sure that you network with fellow investors and you understand what, who they're working with. That's 90% of the battle is just making sure that you're talking to the right person in that game.
Right. Right. Okay. I remember there was one more thing I forgot to ask you, but it'll come back to me.
So
The
it was
last point. I forget now.
the risks, and then we talked about that insurance, mortgage insurance, and then you're right, there was one more. And
there was one more. I'll remember it in a minute. That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so and why you got me on another trail is, as you're talking about interacting with people, you're really good at this. You're a master at networking. It's key. Anybody who's deep in investing will tell you that. First off, who are some people who have kind of encouraged you to go from maybe some riskier investments, or ones that you look back and like, I shouldn't have done that, to where you are today and having such a successful portfolio? And how has networking really opened doors for you? We've heard a few ways here, but maybe in some other ways.
Yeah. So I guess I should just clarify the question here. So you're looking to know right back to the beginning, who said, "Hey, go do this," and then I got burned.
Yeah. Or maybe it's concepts, right? Or books, like something that, I guess for places for people to look and see what you saw.
That's a great question. You know what? The initial inspiration to want to invest in real estate came from being a student at Western and seeing my friends pay $500 a bedroom. I'm like, wait a minute, we're giving all this money to this landlord. And I was, crunching rough numbers and figuring how impactful that would have been if my parents had owned a couple of these buildings that my friends were living in. I'm like, well, that would have changed their lives. They never would have needed to work again. So that was the inspiration. And I probably should have done a lot more education at the time and done a lot more reading and networking. I didn't. And I think that's why I made so many mistakes up front. And, I tried development in 2012, 2013, taking a property, knocking it down and building it into a duplex, failed miserably, didn't end up happening, made the front page of the London Free Press as, big bad Toronto developer, even though I was living around the corner. But that's kind of the way the news works these days, different topic. So I kind of went through that stuff. But my mother-in-law, now she was, just my girlfriend's mom at the time, she was a very incredible real estate investor, developer, no fear. She wouldn't necessarily explain to me how to do things, but I would just see her attitude about things and how she would proceed. And she was okay if not everything worked out perfectly, didn't require perfection, because she knew, in the long run, she always wins. And I've seen that from her. So I was really inspired by her. As I'd mentioned before, my friend Carlo, also investing in student rentals, knew him since, we graduated from the same school. We met in 2010, and I was just watching him along. So we would invest in various different types of properties, parallel to each other. And he really got into these student rentals, doing the BRRRR projects. So I jumped in and I kind of focused more on construction. So I was able to really just start mirroring, successful people and what I saw them doing, and, kind of occasionally asking them questions, but then making sure that I gave them back value. And, because I'm generally a very curious person, so I like to learn about things. So on the construction side, I made it my business to know everything about it, to know how to do it, how to get the permits, how to get the inspections passed, how to do all these things. And because I dove right into building additions on my properties, my friend Carlo and I could share stuff all the time because he didn't like doing that. So I helped him with that. And, just along the way, like, it's kind of a mixture of networking, yes, but trying to add value to people who I regularly want to speak with. And, if you're enjoying yourself, if you're in a business you enjoy and you find it interesting, that becomes very easy. You mentioned that I am pretty well networked. I'm mainly well networked now because of the podcast that I started. And it was one of the big reasons is I wanted to become a central hub for real estate investing in Canada. And, I've still got lots of work to do on that, but I just feel that, by going out there and by being the central hub of information, good things will come. And it's not that I've monetized the podcast. I never have. It's really just a matter of who can I pull out my phone and text today and get a response from. And I'm honored to know the people that I know and be able to speak with them, share ideas with them. And I know in the long run, it's like, how Donald Trump went bankrupt and then was able to rebuild it. Like people who have a wealth of knowledge can rebuild even if they lose. And I just see that value in all the connections I have, and then all I've learned from those connections.
That's
Long-winded,
fantastic.
I know.
You said some
Sorry.
big stuff there. Yeah, that's great. Like, I love the curiosity. I mean, when we look at millionaires, curiosity, asking questions is so good. The networking stuff, so good, all of it. And even with COVID, it's been very difficult to network, go to groups and meetups and stuff. And so the podcast has been an opportunity to meet new faces. I know I've been able to leverage your channel personally to find contacts in arenas that I don't know. So it definitely has become a hub. And I encourage anybody who's listening to our show that doesn't frequently tune into the Andrew Hines Show, please do, especially if you want to get into real estate investing. I remember what we were going to talk about. We're going to talk about maintenance. I'm curious what you budget for your maintenance each year.
Well, okay. So this is more of a philosophical question, because a lot of people will say, well, you budgeted that, but you'll never spend that in a single year. And it's all about for what purpose, right? If I'm trying to apply to a lender, I would use a different number than what I would use as my evaluation when I'm buying something. Yeah. But I like to consider life cycle maintenance and, annual wear and tear. Like if I had to repaint a house, I could spend $3,000, odds and ends, furnace going down. The thing I like to do is I'd say in the average year, I might only spend $3,000 on one house or $2,000, or maybe only $1,500, but probably more like $2,000. But what about that year that I got to replace the furnace? What about that year that I got to spend $10,000 to replace the roof? So I like to budget anywhere from 5 to 8%, maybe even 10%. If I bought an old unrenovated property, I'd probably be budgeting 10% per year on my rents, so that I know that I'm safe. And if I could still cash flow in that scenario, I know that even when the surprises come up, I'm still going to be fine. I'm going to be able to sleep at night. And the biggest thing I learned in my 20s from many restless nights and not being able to sleep is I couldn't sleep because of the decisions I made. I put myself into precarious positions where I didn't have enough cash on hand to cover the unknowns, the things that come up. So the way I've been able to hedge against that is I basically make sure that I carry a reserve in a different bank account for every single property I own. And that for me has worked. Everybody's going to be different. But, I like to let those accounts get north of $15,000 just in case. And when I have that there now, I can sleep. Now, there's a different issue, knowing the inflation that we've got coming with all the government spending that's been happening, which kind of frustrates me to have that money there because I know it's inefficient. It's one of those things that I objectively know is inefficient, but we all have to do what allows us to sleep at night. And that's kind of what's worked for me.
I love the way your mind works, man. That's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, you got to know yourself in this business, eh? Like you really do. That's one of the things I've learned as I come into my 30s. It's about knowing yourself, understanding how you are and how your emotions work.
Yeah. Have you, on the note, I guess, before we move on, I want to ask you a little bit more about the BRRRR and how that's been able to really boost things for you. But I'm curious, as we're on the rental side here, I know I've seen a lot of articles coming out of college towns, university towns that have been struggling with housing for students. Have you found there's been much of a hiccup as we've rounded through that month of May? And, as you've been picking up these tenants, has it changed anything for you? Have you had any vacancies, maybe more than the normal housing type, or not really?
No vacancies yet. I do see potential cause for concern with what's coming, mainly because, one September 1st rolls by and you don't go to school, you say, okay, well, next year we'll be back. That doesn't really change much. The students I speak with, they're like, wow, what are we going to do? Live at home with our parents? No, we're coming to town. So everybody came back, even though they didn't have in-class sessions. They were doing online, but they still wanted to be back in town. And generally I think that that's going to continue, but it's the question of, if we come around to next September and we're still not in class, what's going to happen. And as people who haven't signed yet, you're always going to have those tentative people who wait till the last minute to sign a lease. I was one of them when I was a student. So you're going to have those people that are just going to sit and wait this out. And I have heard a bit of that, but I still see plenty of demand. People still want to sign up their leases for May 1st, anticipating class will be back in session in person as of September 1 this coming year. So I haven't seen too much of a change yet. Everything's been fine and dandy, quite frankly, as far as my portfolio goes. But I'm always thinking, curiously about the future, what could come, what could the implications be of the decisions that are being made now. And I like to hedge myself. So I have sold one of my properties. I am still planning on keeping the ones that I consider, for me to be the ones that are most ideal for my management style, for the way I like to run my properties. But I'm going to be diversifying a little bit because I was pretty heavy into the student rental position. However, I still think it's a fantastic opportunity. I just think that you have to plan for the worst. So if you're going to be in student rentals, make sure that you're invested in a property that could also serve single families, because you never know what could happen. If we have another year of no class, you may want to switch tenants. And I would be, for me to make that decision, I would have to be able to justify that I could cash flow or at least break even in both scenarios. And when I say break even, I mean, I've factored maintenance, I've factored management, anything I'm actually going to pay.
So I guess the question is, where are you headed?
Well, I've got a couple of opportunities, so it really depends on how things unfold over the next few months. I've got a couple of avenues. I may be doing some investing south of the border, and then of course, I really like cottage country. I like the Owen Sound, Wyerton area. So I'm basically getting liquid right now so that I have the ability to buy and build. And whether it be buy here or buy there, as the situation unfolds around the lockdown here and what we can and can't do, that'll sway my decisions.
Interesting. Very cool. Okay. So there's power in having $1,000 a month coming in cash flow. It gives you a little bit of a bit of flexibility, but it doesn't change your life, I guess you could say. No. I'm reading The Ultimate Wealth Builder, I think is the name of the book right now. And it's interesting because the BRRRR strategy allows you to have that money available to deploy again, and it allows you to recycle it. And you mentioned at the beginning of the show, BRRRR is so powerful. I think it's important, maybe once you're analyzing a property, I know you're good at sharing your analysis with listeners. What are some of the things that you look at? Like, what are some of the deals you've had, maybe you've walked into these rentals, the student rentals, to allow for that forced appreciation? And are you able to get the full amount back? Are you able to come out with extra? Do you sometimes have to, because you mentioned you do additions, like, are you having to get extra creative in order to do it? I'm curious what that kind of looks like for you.
Yeah, great question. And it's not like, if people are listening and they're just assuming they can go in and they can see properties at surface value and find a deal that's going to work right away to get like the perfect BRRRR where you pull all your money back out. That's not likely. It's not to say it's impossible, but it's gotten harder in London specifically. I know, other markets like Windsor, it's still very, very possible there. But there are implications to choosing one town over another, and how well hedged you are if students don't come back and all that stuff. So as far as the BRRRR goes, when I was, doing a lot of these BRRRR projects, I even sold a few because it was just so advantageous at the time. I, started a company, flipped a few of them. Basically, I was buying stuff around like 200 grand, 210, and putting around 200 grand in to renovate the inside, build an addition, make it really nice. And then I was getting valuations from appraisers that understood what out of town investors would pay. So there were these investors that were coming from the Toronto area who saw the cash flow that people were getting in London and paying a lot. However, a lot of these transactions were not happening on the market. They were happening off market, realtor to realtor, but it was never listed. So I did my research. I saw these houses changing hands because I was driving around in the neighborhood. I found out who was buying them. And I basically came up with an angle that not everybody knew about. And I'm like, okay, well, in order to do this, I got to do what this other guy's doing. And he's building additions. So I got to build additions. So I started following and basically copying this guy, not knowing everything, but knowing enough to feel confident. And, long and short is I did a handful of properties where I was actually able to pull every last dollar out. So, acquire, $1 million plus in real estate with no money in. And that was really by understanding the value that people are willing to pay. Like, what are people willing to pay? What price range for what cash flow? So I had to understand the back end from an investor's standpoint. What are they looking for in a final product? And then I worked backwards from that to figure out what I could afford to pay. And because it wasn't that I was looking to sell necessarily. It was just, I need to understand, because that's what an appraiser uses as a comparable. What is somebody willing to pay for this? So that was what I was able to do. And, that was, once that happened, I was like, okay, well, this is like printing money. So I'm going to do as much of this as I can. And, it was a lot of work. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's a lot of work managing it, because I started managing these rentals myself. I did everything, not did the work, but I hired the people, started my own company and all that. So I just pushed and pushed and pushed until London's values basically doubled on the type of inventory that I was buying. So it went from being able to buy, a junker at 200 to 210 to now that same junker is like 450. And, yep. That's a pretty substantial difference. And the change for me was, now all of a sudden I'm having to sell these properties at a much higher price point that's actually out of the reach of a lot of people. Not completely, they're still saleable, but it just didn't feel quite as comforting to go after that. I guess I'm a little bit more of a conservative investor after all the mistakes I've made in the past. So I just, I slowed down on that a bit. I've dabbled in some other things, including, doing additions and secondary units and stuff like that. But this is why I'm examining other markets now, because to me, the London market is it's not the opportunity it used to be. It's not to say that there aren't still opportunities there. There are opportunities everywhere. Within 500 meters of your house, there's an opportunity to make probably $1 million. You just need to know how.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna hit you with a bomb here. Okay, I know you're in the economics, you love business. What happens in this market next? I think people can see a little bit with what you said you're planning on doing next, but I'm curious, where should people be selling? Should be buying? You obviously don't like holding cash, but like, what's next?
Yeah, cash is trash. Really, I mean, you need it. It's a necessary evil. Hard assets are the key. Hard assets with real value, and that goes down to absolutely anything that's going to have future value. So whether that's food stores, real estate, gold and silver, things that people are going to value. Say things got bad. Say we hit like hyperinflation. What would people need? People are always going to need housing. They're going to look for a stable form of money, which won't be currency, won't be the Canadian dollar. So things like buying a little bit of gold and silver to have that on hand, coin collecting, that kind of thing. You just never know. I look at the economy and I just see that what we've done is entirely irresponsible and unbalanced as a decision to shut down things the way that they have and engage in government spending the way that they have. I think they're really relying on the ignorance of the Canadian people to get away with these decisions. If they understood what I understood, they'd be very panicked. And I'm not trying to be alarmist here. I think that we just need to, step back here and prepare ourselves. Yeah. So I'm all about diversifying right now. I think getting money on both sides of the border would be a good idea. I think that, just making sure that you've got things that will hold their value if our currency absolutely tanks. And this is why I love real estate. The challenge will be, you're going to have to hold cash reserves for all your real estate, and that cash is going to be devalued. So you have to think, how will I be able to, if we face severe inflation, preserve the value of my existing wealth and make sure that doesn't get diminished. So a delicate balance is needed is probably the oversimplified answer. And I know that might not be what you're looking for, but feel free to kind of poke on that more, and we'll go down the rabbit hole here.
Here's a poke for you. So do you think that given all the irresponsible spending and that the government just kind of shrugs off the fact that interest rates are low, do you think how are we going to pay for it, if at all? Like, is this going to come from the investor's pocket? Because obviously everyone's a lot more happy with taxing the rich, quote unquote rich, right? So
we all know that doesn't happen though, right?
Yeah. So like what's the next move, right? What's the next government move?
I don't think the government has a plan to repay the debt. I think that basically maybe they're planning on inflating it away, like sort of was the approach in Weimar Germany after World War I. But it doesn't really seem like they have a plan. Anytime they're questioned on it, they dodge the question, say interest rates are cheap. But there's a couple of things that you really need to consider here. There's two ways to be taxed. There's the direct tax, which the government takes from you in the form of income tax, sales tax, any other tax that you pay directly. You get a bill, you pay it. And then there's the indirect tax, the sneaky tax that people don't understand, which is inflation. And that's the tax on your buying power. So if you ask for a beer at the bar and they dumped a cup of water into the beer and handed it to you, you say, what the heck is this? I asked for a beer. You gave me a half beer, half water. It'd be really, really odd, and you wouldn't tolerate that. But people tolerate that with their money because they don't understand how the system works. So central banking has allowed for this. And I'll explain this concept and try and keep it as simple as possible. We had roughly a $1 trillion economy last year. And that means that $1 trillion was bought and sold in the economy, including all houses, gasoline, taxes, or sorry, not taxes, but everything the economy is basically using, food, whatever. What happens when you add $500 billion in deficit spending, so money that shouldn't be there? What we have is we have a fractional reserve system with our banks. And that means that the banks don't need to keep all the money on hand. So if you deposit $100 with the bank can turn around and actually lend out $90 of your money without telling you. And that money goes back out into the economy. And then that circulates back to the bank. And then they can lend it out again, $81, and it goes down and down. So in theory, $100 could actually turn into $1,000 through what they call fractional reserve lending, and then the velocity of money, and that's how fast the money transacts in the economy. So if we say hypothetically that $500 billion over the next several years is going to turn into $5 trillion, what happens when you have $5 trillion trying to buy what $1 trillion used to buy? Do prices go up 5 times? Does that happen overnight? Does that take several years to happen? What happens if they keep spending at this rate, keep borrowing at this rate? At what point will our dollar just absolutely collapse? And that's the part that scares the heck out of me, is the velocity at which they're doing this, the speed at which they're borrowing this money and injecting it into our economy, and then what the implications will be. If people save the money up, we won't feel the effects right away. If they start spending it right away, we could see astronomical inflation. We could get into the territory of hyperinflation, although I don't think it'll get that bad right away. So what do I see them doing? I know we've taken a while to get to this. I see them to continue to do what they've been doing so far, which is ignoring the problem and pretending it doesn't exist. So it's up to us to just not believe what they say, because what they say is going to get us in a lot of trouble, and protect ourselves. So I think we're really coming up to a time where we need to be able to provide for ourselves wholly. And I hate kind of talking like this, because I know some people would be like, wow, that sounds really extreme. But I think that it'd be very responsible to have a 30-day food store saved up, have alternative forms of currency. Prepare yourself. I wish that I lived in the country. I would have massive gardens. I'd build a greenhouse, like all that stuff. Like that to me, I'm just thinking like, man, I don't trust these people with what they're doing. Like I really don't. And so I don't know what they're going to do. And that's the problem. None of us do. I can only go on what I've seen. And I just see an extreme level of ignorance. And it's like they're acting like the Canadian people are very dumb, which I don't like. I think that we're smarter than this. And a lot of people are just kind of afraid to say what they're thinking, because they don't want to be, said to be insensitive, or, you just want people to die. No, I think people will suffer either way. So we really need to be balanced here. Sorry, I know that was long-winded.
No, this is good. So let's bring it down to the individual then, right? So, so clearly fixed assets, hard assets are going to be what I agree with you. I think that's the place to be, which includes real estate. Now,
Absolutely.
Given that, do we want, because let's say the value of the dollar is depleting, right, through inflation. Now, does that call us to want to have a larger mortgage and therefore less money in the property? Or is the risk so high that we need to make sure there's enough money in the property so that if things go sideways, then do you understand what I'm saying? I know it's
absolutely
kind of dancing.
Yeah.
There's this balance, right? How much do
Funny,
I put
we
in?
think about the same things.
What's that?
We think about the same things. I'm constantly dissecting these things in my mind.
This is something we can apply, right?
Yeah. I like to go through this scenario, what might happen, right? I think that Canadians have a threshold of what they can pay. And when you see, like, say a town like Hamilton, now when you're paying $600,000 for a bungalow, how long until the average Canadian really just can't qualify for a mortgage on that? Now, granted, the dropping of interest rates has just pushed the prices up a little bit more, but say once they hit $700,000, probably the average Canadian family can't afford that anymore. So what do? They spread. So there's going to come a point where houses can't go up in value too much more at the pace they've been going up. That's not to say that they won't continue, but just people won't be able to afford them, because when inflation hits, it doesn't mean our wages are going to go up. It's just going to make people poor. So I think that the thing we've got to consider is every property individually. What would happen if things got a lot more expensive? How much more can this property's value go up? If the answer is not much, then you're going to want to have some serious equity in that property. And then look at your cash flow. To me, you mentioned before, cash flow isn't going to be the life-changing thing. And I agree. It's the appreciation over time. It's the mortgage pay down over time. Sure, the cash flow is nice, but cash flow buys you time. If you have cash flow, you can stay in that property longer. What's your buffer on cash flow? If you're break even Now, what happens if rents fall? What happens, God forbid, like if you're in the higher price category, if you're, Toronto condo investor downtown, like my wife had a condo, we just sold it, but she was getting at one point $4,000 a month furnished rental. And most recent rent, so we were starting to get offers around like 2,800, 2,900. Wow. So that's over $1,000 drop. Wow. That would have been heavy in the red. So we made the decision, we're going to sell this. Fortunately, got out at the right time, lots of upside there. But you have to look at your asset type. If you're in basic housing that serves the lower class, the middle class, that type of housing is going to be very resilient in this type of a downturn. But if you're in very premium real estate, now all of a sudden you're going to have to make some decisions, because are you hedged if the worst happens? Like, what if people don't need to be downtown Toronto, which they presently don't need to be? What's the demand for your real estate? This is why I never really liked personally investing downtown Toronto, just because for my cash flow needs, for my feeling comfortable and sleeping at night, I didn't see it being overly feasible. So I would really just encourage people to consider your asset class. If you're invested in Toronto, you're going to want to have a bit more equity there in case there is a bit of a downturn. I don't consider the value of the property to be the thing that matters most. It is the cash flow. Because if my value drops below my mortgage, I don't care as long as I'm still cash positive, because I know in the long run that company will improve and will appreciate, especially with the inflation that's coming.
Until they call your mortgage.
Well, can they call it because you're underwater? You'd have to be in default. If you're not in default,
I guess so.
Yeah. So as long as you're servicing your debt, that's the question.
You can carry it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're like $3,000 a month in cash flow, but your property's worth $50,000 less than you owe on it, I mean, do you really care? You can ride that out. I mean, yeah, you don't want that, but you're still positioned to be able to handle it. And I think that that's the key differentiation there. If you're looking for a very specific one size fits all kind of answer, it's hard for me to give that.
Absolutely. Andrew, this has been time well spent. I've learned a ton, and I'm sure our audience has too. Tell us a little bit more about where people can find you if they want to learn more about the Andrew Hines that we've been able to talk to today.
So the easiest place, if you want to kind of follow me and see my stories and what have you, would be Instagram. So at the Andrew Hines. And then if you want to follow the podcast, it's the Andrew Hines Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you just search my name on any of the platforms, you'll find me.
Beautiful. Thanks again. And please, folks, if you can, please if you want to leave a comment for Andrew down below, please do so. And we want to know what you guys thought of the show today, what you learned. And make sure you subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks again, Andrew, for your time.
Thanks for having me.